Hamilton returns to Mercedes. You only saw the press conference on TV. But do you want to know the secret offer Toto Wolff made to Lewis right after the Hungarian Grand Prix? Then this video is for you. Subscribe to stay informed about the latest Formula One news. The silence lingering over Maranello wasn't ordinary. It wasn't the kind of quiet that follows concentration, focus, or recalibration. It was heavy, hollow, and hostile, like the aftermath of something sacred being broken. The birthplace of legends now felt like a haunted cathedral, where there had once been applause, adrenaline, and applause echoing off marble floors. Now there were locked doors, whispering engineers, and security personnel ushering away curious eyes. The fallout from the Australian Grand Prix hadn't just rattled Ferrari's foundations, it obliterated them. Lewis Hamilton, brought in as the icon who would bring glory back to the Scarlet Empire, now appeared like a ghost inside the very palace he was meant to rule. Gone was the fire in his eyes, the pride in his posture, the synergy with his machine. Replaced by exhaustion, disillusionment, and the look of a man betrayed not by fate, but by those who had promised him everything. After dragging the underperforming SF25 to a finish outside the top 10, again, Hamilton wasn't angry. He wasn't shouting. He was numb, detached. Reporters saw it. Fans noticed it. The cameras zoomed in on his 1,000-yard stare, and everyone watching from Monaco to Miami knew this wasn't just another disappointing race. This was the beginning of something unraveling. Subscribe to stay informed about the latest Formula One news. "I'm giving more than I've ever given," he mumbled in the post-race interview, barely audible. But this car, this setup, this direction, it just doesn't want to give anything back. It's not built for me. And maybe I was never part of the plan. What sounded like frustration was, in truth, a declaration. An emotional indictment of a partnership that had already begun to erode from the inside. Behind the scenes, everything exploded. Multiple sources now confirm that shortly after returning to the Ferrari motorhome, Hamilton confronted team principal Frédéric Vasseur in a meeting so volatile that security was instructed to remain outside the door in case voices turned to chaos. There was no mediator, no PR buffer, just two powerful men in a cold glass-walled room, and one sentence that sent chills through every corridor at the Scuderia's temporary HQ. "You no longer belong in red." Those were the words spoken by Vasseur, delivered with surgical calm. Brutal, unforgiving. And Hamilton? He didn't yell. He didn't protest. He simply stood there and replied, "Then give me a car that deserves red." What followed next was unprecedented. Within 48 hours, a stream of private team communications was leaked. Not to tabloids. Not to F1 gossip pages. But to respected insiders with credibility. They detailed everything: how Hamilton's chassis setup suggestions had been repeatedly ignored, how the new floor concept favored Leclerc's high-entry rotation technique, how telemetry showed erratic rear-end behavior specifically under Hamilton's driving profile, and how Ferrari's leadership had willfully chosen to delay corrections. The intent wasn't sabotage. It was something more insidious, systemic favoritism wrapped in denial. The SF25 wasn't bad. It was exclusive, unintentionally molded around one man, while forcing the other to adjust, compromise, and ultimately suffer. Hamilton's side of the garage wasn't just losing races. It was losing relevance. And he knew it. After the leak, the team's public face fell apart. Media sessions were reduced. Communication protocols were tightened. Engineers began to disappear into private meetings that lasted hours. Ferrari's own press officers refused to answer direct questions about the atmosphere between their drivers. And yet, whispers grew louder. Subscribe to stay informed about the latest Formula One news. According to multiple independent paddock insiders, Hamilton's personal assistant and longtime confidant had been spotted in a private hotel suite in Tokyo the day after the race, hosting a sequence of discreet meetings with team representatives from McLaren, Audi, and even a non-F1 manufacturer reportedly eyeing entry in 2026. These weren't rumors. These were contingency plans. The situation had deteriorated beyond repair. While Leclerc continued to deliver on-track results, he did so with the eerie awareness that he was now at the center of an internal civil war. His interviews turned cold. His tone lost warmth. For the first time in years, he looked guilty of success. Because somewhere in the back of his mind, he knew his car wasn't the same. Not in setup. Not in response. Not in evolution. In a particularly tense debrief in Imola, insiders say Hamilton dropped a truth bomb that left the room speechless. "We wear the same uniform. But this feels like two teams pretending to be one." Not even Leclerc responded. And then came the Barcelona test weekend, a pivotal moment, both technically and politically. Hamilton's car was fitted with new floor elements and a revised rear suspension package that had previously only been tested with Leclerc's feedback in mind. Expectations were low. But what happened shocked even the skeptics. For the first time in 5 races, Hamilton topped a practice session. His long-run pace was consistent. He looked comfortable in the car. And yet, there was no celebration. No smile. Because he knew what the timing screens couldn't show, it had taken 3 months, multiple leaks, and the threat of departure to finally be heard. In private, Hamilton's camp had already made their position clear. If Ferrari fails to deliver parity, not just in equipment, but in influence, a split before the summer break is on the table. And suddenly, everyone around the paddock began asking the impossible. What happens if Hamilton walks away mid-season? Would Ferrari replace him immediately? Would a reserve driver fill the most prestigious seat in F1 history? Would Mercedes intervene? Could McLaren make space? Would Audi fast-track their timeline? One thing is certain, if Hamilton pulls the pin, it won't be with bitterness, it'll be with clarity. He came to Ferrari to write history. Instead, he's become part of a cautionary tale. And now, the legend has reached his threshold. Because for all the trophies, all the records, and all the reverence, Lewis Hamilton is still a competitor. Still a builder. Still a believer. But even believers stop believing when their faith becomes fuel for someone else's agenda. And when that day comes, when he finally walks out of the garage in red for the last time, it won't be a press release that confirms it. Subscribe to stay informed about the latest Formula One news. It'll be the silence. The same silence that began in Maranello, long before anyone outside ever noticed. Long before the dust had settled over Albert Park, long before the headlines could fully dissect the implosion unraveling at Ferrari, one man, watching from a different hemisphere, had already felt the shift. He hadn't spoken publicly. Not once. No cryptic tweets, no offhand remarks in interviews, not even a wink to the media. Silence. But inside his mind, calculations were already in motion. Toto Wolff didn't need to see telemetry to understand the situation. He knew it in his bones. He recognized the look in Hamilton's eyes after the race. Not frustration, not disappointment, but something colder, deeper. Disillusionment. And he'd seen that look before. Because he knew Lewis Hamilton like no one else in the paddock ever could. Not as a statistic. Not as a headline. As a man. As a force of nature. As a brother-in-arms forged through a decade of total domination and shared trauma. And now, that force was flickering. Russell was doing well. Consistent. Precise. But not magnetic. Not transcendent. Antonelli? A diamond still buried beneath layers of pressure, expectation, and inexperience. The kid had brilliance, no doubt. But under the relentless spotlight of Mercedes-AMG, the raw potential was turning to cracked glass. Rookie errors. Lost confidence. Tentative radio calls. He was drowning in silence. Toto had promised the board that Mercedes wouldn't rebuild, they'd reload. But 3 races in, it felt more like a slow unraveling. They weren't plummeting. But they weren't climbing either. They were hovering. Weightless. Leaderless. Until that post-race interview. "I feel useless," Hamilton had whispered into the mic. It wasn't a statement. It was a confession. A cry between the lines. And Toto heard it. Loud and clear. No calls to managers. No emails. Just one direct message, encrypted, short, and impossible to misinterpret. Face to face. Midnight. "I'll be waiting." The location wasn't glamorous. No penthouse suite. No boardroom. Just an old industrial garage on the edge of the city, Melbourne's forgotten skeleton. The kind of place where nobody asked questions. 2 chairs. A steel table. A single overhead bulb buzzing with decay. Hamilton arrived in silence. Hoodie up. No entourage. No security. The echoes of the paddock's chaos still clung to his skin like oil. He didn't walk in like a superstar. He drifted, haunted, hollow, heavy. Toto was already there. Arms folded. Eyes watching. Not judgmental. Not sentimental. Just present. Lewis looked at him for a long beat. Then finally muttered, "Didn't expect you to reach out." Toto didn't smile. He didn't need to. Didn't expect to watch you fall apart. The silence that followed was surgical, cutting away all the noise, all the PR gloss, all the layers of manufactured calm. Hamilton pulled out a chair, sat down slowly. His hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from fatigue. The kind that doesn't come from racing. The kind that comes from pretending. "You think I made a mistake," he said flatly. Toto leaned forward, his voice steady but sharp. "No. I think you followed your heart. But Maranello doesn't understand hearts. It understands politics. Heritage. Mythology. You walked into a cathedral expecting a team. What you found was a museum." Lewis let out a breath. Part laugh, part groan. "They don't listen. Not really. They nod. They smile. They say they're building for the future. But they're still stuck in 2004. Toto's expression didn't change. "You're not built for nostalgia. You're built for war." A long pause. The sound of a cargo train somewhere in the distance filled the air like background music to a confession. "I'm tired," Lewis said, finally. "Not of racing. Not of driving. But of pretending this red suit still means something." Toto looked him dead in the eye. Then stopped pretending. There was a flicker, small, almost imperceptible, in Hamilton's gaze. Doubt? Hope? Maybe both. "You can't unmake a decision like this," Lewis said. "There's no clean way back." "I'm not offering a way back," Toto replied. "I'm offering a way forward." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small object, sleek matte black, engraved with nothing but a single letter M. He placed it gently on the table. "No contracts. No leaks. No headlines. Not yet. But if the day comes, and I believe it will, this is your seat. Not a temporary fix. Not a retirement tour. A second empire." Lewis stared at it. It wasn't a key. It wasn't a proposal. It was a promise. He didn't reach for it. But he didn't look away either. "I can't walk away from Ferrari mid-season," he said. "I'm not asking you to," Toto answered. "But if you reach your limit, and something tells me you're close, you know where the ignition is." Another pause. Then, Lewis spoke with a voice that trembled from truth. "They lied to me, Toto. They told me I'd lead. They told me I'd build. But all they wanted was the brand." "And all I ever wanted," Toto replied, rising from his chair, "was the driver." With that, he walked to the door, hand on the handle, but stopped for a moment. "One more thing," he said without turning around. "Don't let them kill your fire just because they can't handle your heat." And then he was gone. Hamilton sat alone in the flickering light, surrounded by silence. The black emblem sat before him. No noise. No audience. No pressure. Just a decision. And deep in his chest, beneath the scars, something stirred again. Not anger. Not sadness. Purpose. He didn't knock. Toto simply walked into the hospitality suite, eyes scanning the room until they landed on the figure by the window, motionless, half in shadow, wearing the unmistakable red that now felt more like a burden than a badge. Lewis didn't turn. Didn't flinch. He already knew who it was. For a few moments, Toto just stood there. Silent. Watching. And then finally soft, but unshakable. "You've gone quiet." No response. "I've known you for nearly 20 years, Lewis," Toto said, stepping forward, voice measured but layered with restrained urgency. "I've seen you broken. I've seen you betrayed. I've seen you with the weight of the world on your shoulders. But never like this." Still nothing. Lewis stared out at the Monza paddock, sun setting over the grid, the sound of distant power units growling like echoes of a life that no longer felt like his. "I watched you all weekend," Toto continued. "Every press conference. Every walk through the paddock. Every stare into the camera. You weren't there. Not the real you. Not the gladiator. Not the soul of the storm." Lewis's eyes flicked downward. You looked like a man drowning in silence. Toto stepped closer, his words gaining weight. They've hollowed you out, Lewis. Slowly. Quietly. One compromise at a time. You arrived full of fire, and they responded with bureaucracy. With politics. With a red suit tailored to their image, not yours. Finally, Hamilton spoke, barely above a whisper. You said this would happen. Toto didn't blink. Not because I wanted it to. Because I saw it coming the moment you signed. I knew what you'd be to them, a marketing weapon. A symbol. A figurehead they could parade, but never follow. I thought I could change it, Lewis muttered. I thought I could be the one to do what no one else could. And maybe you still can, Toto said, eyes narrowing. But not like this. Not while they're trying to domesticate you. They want your name, but not your roar. Your presence, but not your leadership. I thought winning with Ferrari would mean everything, Lewis said, voice raw. I thought it would be the pinnacle. The fairy tale ending. Fairy tales are for people who don't know how this sport really works, Toto replied. This world isn't scripted. It's a war. And right now, you're fighting with one arm tied behind your back and a team that keeps handing you a dull blade. Lewis exhaled, slow and heavy. I don't know if I have anything left to give. Toto took another step. There was no anger in his tone. Just clarity. You've never stopped giving. Even when the car failed. Even when the people around you fell short. Even when the headlines turned. You gave everything. And they gave you resistance. A long pause. Toto's next words were quiet. Intimate. Come back. Lewis's head turned slightly. Come home. The words hung in the air like smoke. Between them, a history of battles fought side by side. Of titles won in impossible fashion. Of heartbreak, redemption, and the pursuit of perfection. Lewis let out a bitter laugh, eyes glistening. Home doesn't always welcome those who walk away. Ours does, Toto said without hesitation. It always will. Because home isn't about who stayed, it's about who belonged. Lewis turned fully now, finally facing him. His voice cracked. You've got George. Kimi's rising. You've moved on. Toto's expression hardened. George is strong. Kimi is promising. But leadership? Experience? Audacity? That can't be taught. Right now, we have talent. What we need is a commander. Someone who knows how to drag a car beyond its capabilities and make it look effortless. Lewis shook his head. I'm not the same anymore. No, Toto agreed. You're not. You're sharper. Heavier with truth. Hungrier. Because now you've seen what racing without soul feels like. What it means to be part of something that looks legendary from the outside, but is hollow within. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. This team. Mercedes. We didn't just build cars. We built belief. And that belief still has your fingerprints on it. Lewis stared into the distance again. I wanted to conquer with red. I wanted to silence the doubters. Toto's voice was steel now. Then do it. But not by dying slowly in someone else's system. Do it by reminding the world who the hell you are. Do it where you're trusted. Where you're feared. A long pause. The air between them felt charged. Like something seismic was about to shift. Lewis leaned forward slightly, voice barely audible. Coming back. It'd mean admitting I failed. No, Toto whispered. It would mean choosing yourself. That's not failure. That's clarity. There it was. The unspoken truth Lewis had buried for months. He'd tried everything. Counseling with the engineers, bonding with the crew, pushing through the media noise, sacrificing his natural instincts to adapt to a team that never wanted the full Lewis Hamilton, only the version that fit their mold. And now, with every fiber of him exhausted, someone had finally told him the truth. The silence stretched. Then, softly, I miss the fight, Lewis said. I miss the us against the world. Toto nodded slowly. So bring it back. No promises were made. No contracts signed. But something changed in that room. Something reborn. A heartbeat restarting. Lewis stood a little taller. Toto turned to leave. but paused at the door. "When you're ready," he said, "there's always a seat in Brackley with your name on it." Then he was gone. And for the first time in months, Lewis Hamilton smiled, not because everything was fixed, but because he remembered who he was. And the world? It hadn't seen the last of him. Not even close. Toto didn't speak immediately. He simply observed Lewis Hamilton with the trained gaze of a man who had built empires from pressure and rebuilt dynasties from rubble. The man standing in front of him wasn't just a driver. He was a battlefield, scarred by time, betrayal, headlines, broken promises, and a year at Ferrari that had nearly extinguished everything that made him the legend he was. But it hadn't. Not completely. Toto saw it now, clearer than ever before. That unmistakable flicker in Lewis's eyes, rage tempered by wisdom, pain alchemized into resolve. The embers of something far more dangerous than talent or speed, clarity. And Toto didn't hesitate. He gave a slow, purposeful nod. His voice came low and deliberate, like a fuse being lit. "No. You're not the same man who left us," he said. "You're more dangerous now. Because you've known humiliation. You've stood on the edge of your own myth and looked down. And you survived. You felt the cold bite of betrayal, the silence of being written off. You've tasted failure, real, soul-crushing failure. And now, you finally understand the cost of greatness." A pause. "You understand what's at stake, not just points or podiums, but identity, legacy, blood." Hamilton looked away for a moment, swallowing hard. Not because he was afraid, but because he was waking up. Not to the man he once was, but to the warrior he needed to become. The silence wasn't awkward. It was sacred. A baptism in fire and memory. Then came the words, quiet, hesitant, but electric with implication. "What about the contract?" Toto didn't blink. "I'll handle it." Hamilton nodded, slowly. Another question followed. "And the sponsors?" Toto's smirk curled like a razor's edge. "They'll beg to be part of this. Every brand loves a legend, but what they crave, what they pray for, is a resurrection." Lewis exhaled, heavier this time. Then, with more steel in his voice. "The media?" Toto chuckled, a short, knowing sound filled with weaponized confidence. "They're starving for a narrative. And this? This is a masterpiece. They don't want dominance anymore. They want chaos. They want blood. They want a comeback wrapped in controversy. You're exactly what they've been waiting for." Lewis nodded again. But there was one question left. The question that burned more than all the others. The one that haunted him in the quiet hours. The one that lingered every time he looked in the mirror and saw the ghosts of 2021, the disillusionment of 2024, and the silence of a red garage that never welcomed him in full. "Will the team accept me?" It was whispered, barely audible. Not because of fear, but because of how badly he needed the truth. Toto didn't hesitate. He stepped forward, placed a steady hand on Lewis's shoulder, and met his eyes without flinching. "They never stopped waiting for you." And just like that, it all cracked. Not with noise, not with rage, but with an internal rupture, a tectonic shift within Hamilton's soul. He didn't cry. He didn't smile. But something broke open. Something primal. Something sacred. The weight of Ferrari's betrayal. The crushing silence of Abu Dhabi. The months of self-doubt disguised as stoicism. The headlines calling him washed, done, irrelevant. The teammates who smiled in public and twisted knives in private. All of it began to burn away. What remained wasn't the flawless, polished world champion of the past. What remained was forged steel. Hardened by failure. Tempered by pain. Unshakable. He looked around that dim, industrial Mercedes garage. The concrete walls that once echoed with victory songs. The shadows that still remembered what domination felt like. This was no longer just a comeback. It was an uprising. Hamilton wasn't returning for nostalgia. He was returning to burn the old order down. To remind the world that legacy isn't built in comfort, it's born in fire. To take everything that had been denied, ripped away, manipulated, spun, and reclaim it by force. Toto didn't say another word. He didn't need to. The contract would be written in blood. The sponsors would fall into line. The journalists would light their torches. The paddock would quake. Because Lewis Hamilton was no longer playing the sport. He was taking it hostage. The circuit had barely begun to stir. The coffee machines hissed softly in the back of hospitality tents. The tire blankets warmed silently in garages. And PR teams were still buried in briefing documents that would be obsolete before the second espresso kicked in. But while the paddock yawned into another routine race weekend, a covert operation, strategic, urgent, and meticulously engineered, was already firing on all cylinders behind the scenes. No press releases. No camera flashes. No one outside of a tightly controlled circle had any clue that the sport was on the verge of one of the most explosive driver exits in modern Formula One history. In a quiet high-security video call suite nestled deep inside the motorhome compound, Mercedes' internal legal unit had initiated what could only be described as a silent blitzkrieg. With military precision, they presented a comprehensive strategy to Ferrari's top legal counsel. Contracts dissected, exit clauses dissected, and NDAs drafted thicker than race weekend technical directives. Every scenario had been accounted for. Every risk had been weighed. Every headline was already pre-written. And every inch of Lewis Hamilton's complicated high-profile Ferrari deal was about to be unraveled piece by piece. What was being put into motion wasn't just an exit. It was a calculated extraction, surgical, quiet, devastating. While most teams were still analyzing tire data or arguing over aero packages, Toto Wolff was moving pieces across a chessboard that no one else even knew existed. He wasn't asking for permission. He wasn't negotiating for 2026. He was forcing open a door that had been slammed in his face 18 months ago, and he wanted Hamilton back under the silver arrows before the European stretch of the calendar kicked off. Not in 6 months. Not next year. Now. The ambition was bold. The messaging, even bolder. Mercedes wasn't simply offering Hamilton a seat. They were offering him redemption, resurrection, and revenge, all wrapped in brushed aluminum. They weren't just rebuilding a legend. They were rearming a weapon that Ferrari had fumbled. Meanwhile, inside Ferrari, panic was beginning to spread, silently, insidiously, like smoke beneath a locked door. Maranello's inner circle had gone from swagger to survival mode overnight. The very same board members who had once paraded Hamilton's signature as a victory against Mercedes were now holding emergency calls, trying to contain the implosion. Fred Vasseur, once so publicly confident in his leadership and his vision for this so-called super team, now looked like a man slipping through quicksand in full uniform. His credibility, already questioned after his tone-deaf handling of internal dynamics, was rapidly evaporating. The very same upper management that had applauded his pursuit of Hamilton was now demanding answers. Why had a 7-time world champion, with nothing left to prove and everything to offer, been pushed to the brink within a matter of months? Where had it all gone so catastrophically wrong? Inside sources whispered about desperate midnight appeals. Vasseur reportedly tried to salvage the situation by offering Hamilton control over development direction, by promising transparency in strategy calls, even by suggesting a revised team dynamic between the two drivers. But it was too late. The damage was terminal. The silence between driver and team principal had become deafening. The trust was shattered. The belief in the vision had withered into skepticism. And behind all the PR smiles and choreographed paddock footage, there was another fracture, quieter, more personal. The rift between the drivers. Charles Leclerc, Ferrari's chosen heir, the man who had once shared laughter and late-night sim sessions with Hamilton, was now caught in a storm he never intended to spark. There were no harsh words between them. No public fallout. But the distance was unmistakable. It hadn't always been this way. When Lewis had first walked through the Ferrari garage doors, Charles had been welcoming, supportive, even protective. He understood what it meant to step into the cauldron of expectation. And when Vasseur's comments became sharper, colder, less constructive, Charles had been the only one to put a hand on Hamilton's shoulder and say, "You don't deserve this." But weeks passed. Races came and went. The internal tension grew louder than engine noise. And Charles, though never antagonistic, began to step back. Not out of cruelty, but out of helplessness. He had tried to defend Hamilton internally. He had argued that the car's inconsistencies were not a reflection of driver failure. But the team wasn't listening. And the weight of being the future of Ferrari left him caught in the middle of a war he didn't ask to fight. Now, Charles watched the walls collapse with a heavy conscience. In every team meeting, every engineering debrief, he felt the space between them stretch wider. He'd glance over, catch Lewis with his arms crossed, eyes narrowed, mind somewhere far beyond Maranello. He knew that look. It wasn't frustration. It wasn't defeat. It was escape. Charles hadn't wanted to be the reason Hamilton walked away. But deep down, he was beginning to understand that Lewis wasn't walking away from him. He was escaping the system. The culture. The myth of Ferrari, that beneath the red paint and the tifosi chants, there was an institution incapable of accepting greatness on someone else's terms. Back at Mercedes, preparations accelerated. A new seat mold was already being fabricated. PR teams were crafting language that could simultaneously honor Ferrari and undermine it without ever using a single controversial word. Mutual respect. A return to familiar ground. An exciting new chapter. All euphemisms for the truth, Mercedes was taking back what had always been theirs. The press didn't see it coming. Not yet. But whispers began circulating. Journalists noticed the unusual quiet around Hamilton. Leaked photos showed Toto meeting someone in Monaco behind tinted glass. Anonymous emails flooded inboxes. Cryptic tweets from insiders hinted at unfinished business and loyalty lost and found. What the world would soon discover was not just a transfer. It wasn't a reshuffle. It wasn't about performance, or contracts, or timing. It was a reckoning. A driver who had been promised a renaissance was instead handed a throne built on sand. A champion who had been expected to lead was disrespected by the very people who had begged for his signature. And now the champion was preparing to return, not as a broken exile, but as a force reawakened, rearmed, and roaring for vengeance. The paddock would wake up soon. And when it did, it wouldn't be to news of a swap or a departure. It would be to the sound of thunder. Hamilton was coming home. And this time, he wouldn't just be racing. He'd be hunting. He didn't need to set an alarm. He never did, not for days like this. The light breaking through the curtains in his Monte Carlo apartment didn't feel warm. It felt surgical, cold, like truth slicing through silence. Lewis Hamilton had barely slept, but he didn't feel tired. There was no exhaustion, no restlessness, just clarity. Pure, terrifying clarity. He picked up his phone and stared at the screen. It was happening. The push notification had just landed, lighting up phones across continents. Scuderia Ferrari and Lewis Hamilton have mutually agreed to part ways, effective immediately. Mutual? That word echoed in his head like a cruel joke. There had been nothing mutual about it. It had been months of passive aggression, strategic exclusions, withheld updates, subtle sabotage wrapped in red velvet. But now the veil had fallen. The illusion was over. The partnership was dead. Across the world, racing fans froze. The rumor mill stopped turning. Even the engines in Imola's garages seemed to hold their breath. And then, exactly 1 hour and 4 minutes later, the world flipped on its axis. No warning. No build-up. Just one tweet, posted by Mercedes-AMG Petronas, 7 words long. He's coming home. Hamilton x Mercedes. 2025. No emojis. No countdown. No flare. Just a digital explosion that set every circuit ablaze. Within seconds, the internet lost its mind. Social feeds became battlefields of joy, nostalgia, and shock. Hashtags like #WelcomeBackLewis, #HamiltonReturns, and #RedemptionTour surged to the top of the trending lists in over 30 countries. YouTube lit up with instant reaction videos, fans screaming, crying, shaking, overwhelmed. TikTok flooded with cinematic edits of his greatest moments in silver, set to orchestral scores and slow-motion overtakes. Grandfathers, teenagers, and toddlers all shared one sentence. He's back. But this wasn't just about a contract. This was a shift in the balance of power. This was history reactivating itself. Back in Brackley, the energy was indescribable. Inside the Mercedes F1 campus, people ran through hallways like it was a championship Sunday. Departments that hadn't collaborated in years were suddenly syncing timelines. CAD files were being reopened. Simulator schedules were being rewritten. Calendar alerts flooded the screens of aerodynamicists, strategists, software engineers. Because this wasn't just a reunion. This was an uprising. The moment the announcement hit, dozens of former Hamilton crew members received new internal messages. Subject: reassignment, Project 44. Immediate. Inside sources claimed a brand new chassis, codename MH2 Mission Hamilton 2.0, was already deep in development. This wasn't going to be an iteration. It was going to be an overhaul. A rebirth. Mercedes wasn't planning to bring Hamilton back to compete. They were bringing him back to dominate. And the confirmation everyone had waited for? Bono was returning to the pit wall. Peter Bonington, the calm voice behind 7 world titles. The man whose radio messages were now legendary. The voice that had screamed "It's hammer time," and "Get in there, Lewis," was back in the headset. Back in his corner. Like nothing had ever changed. But it had. Everything had changed. Hamilton was no longer just the driver who once ruled Formula One. He was now a man who had stared down Ferrari's maze of politics, endured the media circus, shouldered the weight of false hope, and walked away, not broken but reborn. The fire inside him was no longer about legacy. That was already carved in stone. This was about vengeance. Righteous, focused, surgical vengeance. In the weeks that followed, whispers leaked from behind Brackley's closed doors. Lewis was spending endless hours in the simulator. Not for sponsorship. Not for appearances. But because he wanted to. Because he was building again, lap by lap, setup by setup. Engineers described his focus as unshakable. His feedback, they said, was even sharper than 2018. One technician put it plainly. He's not here to play games. He's here to reclaim his crown. Meanwhile, Imola approached. The paddock pretended to focus on the present, but every conversation came back to one thing. Hamilton. 2025. The comeback of comebacks. Rival drivers whispered in the hospitality suites. Some were thrilled. Some were terrified. One anonymous source from a top 3 team reportedly said, if Mercedes gets it even half right, he'll torch the grid. Over at Ferrari, the mood was catastrophic. Staff were told not to comment. The press office issued bland statements. Behind the scenes, however, insiders spoke of panic. Sponsors were furious. Morale had plummeted. The media speculated whether Vasseur would survive the year. Some engineers had already begun drafting resumes. Because everyone knew what they had just done. They hadn't just let Lewis go. They sent him back to the one place he's unstoppable. Hamilton had never truly belonged in red. The suit didn't fit. The system didn't welcome him. The culture didn't understand him. But silver? That was home. That was fire and steel and precision and freedom. That was where he became the man who conquered time. Now, he wasn't returning to chase headlines. He was returning to write a new era. A sharper, darker, more determined chapter of his story. Not a fairy tale, but a war cry. A warning to every team still comfortable on the throne. Because when Lewis Hamilton smiles now, it's not with innocence. It's with intent. Not because he escaped Ferrari. But because, after all the noise, after all the silence, after all the sabotage and the sleepless nights, he's finally back where he was always meant to be.